أعلن افتتاح جلسة مجلس.
The 8,998th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Poland and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Rosemary Carlo, Under-Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Mr. Raouf Mazou, Assistant High Commissioner for Operations, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, Director General of the World Health Organization. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Mr. President, daily attacks continue to batter Ukrainian cities. Many are reportedly indiscriminate, resulting in civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. Between 24 February and 15 March, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights recorded 1,900 civilian casualties. The total consists of 726 people killed, including 52 children, and 1,174 injured, including 63 children. The actual number is likely much higher. Most of these casualties were caused by the use in populated areas of explosive weapons with a wide impact area. Hundreds of residential buildings have been damaged or destroyed, as have hospitals and schools. OHCHR continues to monitor reports of civilian casualties in the whole country, including in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. OHCHR staff in Donetsk are closely following the developments regarding the 14 March incident in which 20 civilians were reportedly killed by a Tochka-U missile that may have contained cluster munitions. All such instances must be properly investigated. It is the responsibility of all sides to fully abide by their obligations to protect the lives of all civilians everywhere. OHCHR is gravely concerned about reports of arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances of civilians, local authorities, and civil society activists in Russian-controlled areas. We call for their immediate release. Mr. President, this week there were positive signals reported regarding the ongoing direct talks between Ukrainian and Russian representatives. We welcome all such engagements. However, we note that these signals have so far not translated into the cessation of hostilities that is so desperately needed. The situation in the southeastern port city of Mariupol is particularly alarming. Many of the Mariupol residents who have not been able to safely evacuate lack food, water, electricity, and medical care. Uncollected corpses lie on city streets. Yesterday's strike on the Mariupol theater, which reportedly served as a bomb shelter for displaced civilians, adds to the list of attacks against civilian structures. While early reports indicate that the worst may have been avoided, ongoing fighting is hampering the rescue work and assessment of the situation. Mr. President, the devastation and suffering in Mariupol and Kharkiv raises grave fears about the fate of millions of residents of Kiev and other cities facing intensifying attacks. International humanitarian law is crystal clear. Civilians are entitled to protection against the dangers arriving from military operations. Direct attacks on civilians are prohibited. Yet, the magnitude of civilian casualties and the destruction of civilian infrastructure in Ukraine cannot be denied. This demands a thorough investigation and accountability. Mr. President, the priority for the UN and its partners is to reach the people trapped by the ongoing shelling, including in eastern Ukraine. To that end, we continue to scale up our operations on the ground as circumstances permit. The needs of the population are growing by the day. The UN calls for safe passage for civilians from and humanitarian supplies into encircled areas. We are grateful to neighboring governments for their generosity in receiving refugees and enabling the provision of assistance to Ukraine. The UN is requesting all donors to fast-track funding against pledges made toward the Ukraine flash appeal. The appeal, which seeks $1.1 billion to help 12 million people in need, is 36% funded. Mr. President, UNDP projects that 90% of the Ukrainian population could be facing poverty and extreme economic vulnerability should the war continue, setting the country and the region back decades and leaving deep social and economic scars. As the Secretary General highlighted, dangerous ripple effects of the conflict are already being felt across the globe. Russia and Ukraine represent more than half of the world's supply of sunflower oil and 30% of the world's wheat. Food, fuel, and fertilizer prices are skyrocketing. Supply chains are being disrupted. All of this is hitting the poorest the hardest and potentially creating instability around the globe. The Secretary General announced on 14 March the establishment of a global crisis response group on food, energy, and finance to lead an effort with member states to deal with the complex fallout of the war. The Deputy Secretary General will lead an interagency steering committee with partners to oversee this effort. Mr. President, the Secretary General welcomes all ongoing diplomatic contacts. He remains actively engaged with leaders who are trying to bring about an end to this war. There will be no winners to this senseless conflict. The tremendous loss it is causing, on the other hand, is heartbreakingly clear. And it is going to get much, much worse the longer the fighting continues. The Secretary General urges intensified and coordinated political efforts for an immediate cessation of hostilities. There must be a meaningful, sustained political process to enable a peaceful settlement. The lives of millions of Ukrainians and the peace and security of the entire region and possibly beyond depend on it. Thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر السيدة.
I thank Ms. De Carlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Raouf Mazou.
Mr. President, it has been less than 3 weeks since High Commissioner Grandi addressed this council. Within this short time span, the number of refugees from Ukraine in the neighboring countries has risen exponentially from the then 520,000 to over 3.1 million today, in what has become the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. With close to 2 million refugees from Ukraine, Poland has, in a matter of a few weeks, become one of the largest refugee hosting countries in the world. Some 490,000 people have fled to Romania, 350,000 to Moldova, 280,000 to Hungary, and 228,000 to Slovakia. Hundreds of thousands have now reached other European countries. A sizable number of people have also moved to the Russian Federation and to a smaller extent to Belarus. We are humbled by the remarkable resilience of the refugees, many of whom have left their home with next to nothing, and by the extraordinary hospitality of the host authorities and host communities. This solidarity illustrates the very foundation of the international refugee protection architecture and the spirit of the Global Compact on Refugees. The acts of compassion, humanity, and kindness we now witness daily bring hope and brighten an otherwise very grim reality. We strongly commend the governments of receiving countries for keeping their borders open to all those fleeing Ukraine, including third country nationals who must continue to be received without any discrimination. The robust response that these countries have mounted from scratch in an extremely short period of time is truly impressive. We are heartened by the bilateral and other support extended to the principal refugee hosting countries and the funding committed to us so far in support of the $1.1 billion US dollar flash appeal for the response inside Ukraine and for the $550.6 million US dollars towards the UNHCR-led regional refugee response plan, both launched on the 1st of March. The outpouring of support from the private sector and individuals who have jointly provided some 2/3 of the funds raised for the response so far must be lauded. All international support to the response is coordinated under the refugee coordination model led by UNHCR, which has been established in Poland, Moldova, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia, as well as in other countries in the region. The sum of collective expertise and support will be critical to help the refugee population and support host countries with shelter, emergency relief items, cash assistance, as well as mental health and psychosocial support. UNHCR has scaled up its response by deploying over 200 experts and established field presence in all countries. UNHCR staff on the ground undertake regular protection monitoring at the main border crossing points, reception centers, and other locations where refugee transit or gather. However, with the current pace of refugee outflows, the capacity of neighboring countries are being tested and stretched. We can and must do more to support, and we must do it now. As the situation evolves, UNHCR, in coordination with the host governments and partners, will assess the needs as necessary and is currently adjusting the regional refugee response plan. While some refugees transit through countries neighboring Ukraine, many also join families which have long settled in these countries. This is particularly the case in Poland, where with time passing and resources diminishing, the number of refugees needing integration will rise. They and the state which hosts them will need support to ensure their inclusion in all sectors of public life, health and education, access to labor and other services. With EU host countries receiving support from the rest of the Union, we are particularly concerned about the situation in Moldova, where over 350,000 people have arrived. This refugee crisis comes on top of pre-existing challenges. It is therefore crucial that sufficient resources are made available quickly to support the government's response. As critical as it is, funding is only one of the many forms of support that are urgently needed. We commend the recent launch of the EU Solidarity Platform, designed to ease the pressure on the countries neighboring Ukraine through transfers of vulnerable refugees to the other EU member states. We are grateful to those member states that have already made concrete pledges to transfer refugees from Moldova and encourage others to join this initiative, which constitutes a remarkable and innovative example of responsibility sharing in line with the key tenets of the Global Compact on Refugees. In addition, the EU activated for the first time in its history the Temporary Protection Directive, which enables refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless persons to arriving in Ukraine to quickly regularize their legal status, alleviating pressure on asylum systems. It shall also enable refugees to find work, access services, and benefit from social protection. Such temporary protection has also been announced by the governments of the United States, Canada, Switzerland, Brazil, and others. Mr. President, I wish to further highlight that 90% of the refugees fleeing Ukraine are women and children, indicating the heightened risk of gender-based violence and other forms of exploitation and abuse, including trafficking. As the Secretary General said, for predators, human traffickers, and human traffickers, war is not a tragedy, it is an opportunity. We are deeply concerned about media reports of incidents of gender-based violence and trafficking, and are supporting the efforts of government in scaling up prevention and risk mitigation measures, including through the Stay Safe campaign aimed at awareness raising and provision of information to refugees. As part of UNHCR's leading role in coordinating the UN refugee response, we have also deployed experts in PSEA coordinators to support the government's response in several refugee hosting countries. Mr. President, since the early days of this crisis, UNHCR committed to stay and deliver in Ukraine, and this is what we have done. Allow me to take this opportunity to express our deepest gratitude and admiration for our colleagues who have remained in Ukraine, but also to the whole humanitarian community. We believe that at least 2 million people have been forced to flee within Ukraine. Close to 13 million people have been affected in the hardest hit area, hardest hit by the war in Ukraine. Many people remain trapped in areas of escalating conflict and, with essential services disrupted, are unable to meet even the most basic of their needs. In many locations, such as Mariupol, residents face a critical and potentially fatal shortage of food, water, and medicines. People living with disability or serious medical condition are particularly impacted. UNHCR is closely tracking negotiation for safe passage and is preparing to send humanitarian supplies as soon as conditions allow. To facilitate the provision of life-saving assistance to the population most in need in Ukraine, we have adjusted our operational presence, relocating offices and warehouses to the western and central part of the country. Together with partners, we have been able to deliver critical supplies for displaced and conflict-affected populations, including core relief items and shelter materials. We're working closely with local authorities to establish and expand reception capacity in main locations where internally displaced people arrive. We coordinate the provision of key protection services such as legal aid, social accompaniment, psychosocial support, child protection, and gender-based violence case management. Where conditions allow, we distribute multi-purpose cash to help people make choices best suited to their needs. Flexible forms of assistance are crucial, as are innovative approaches. Despite all efforts, we are unable to respond to the sheer scale of the rapidly growing needs of the Ukrainian people and systematically deliver the much needed life-saving assistance. We cannot overemphasize the urgent call repeatedly made by the Secretary General, USGD Carlo, ERC Griffiths. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. International humanitarian law must be upheld, and safe passage for civilians in any direction they choose must be enabled. Safe humanitarian access to those in need and unhindered delivery of aid, including through a functioning humanitarian notification system, remains of paramount importance. Mr. President, in conclusion, allow me to paraphrase High Commissioner Grandi, who is today in Tajikistan after having left Afghanistan yesterday. On numerous occasions, he stressed that as we respond to the crisis in Ukraine, we cannot abandon or forget other recent and protracted humanitarian crises in many regions of Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. Thank you.
أشكر السيد
I thank Mr. Mazu for his briefing. I now give the floor to Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus.
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to address it today. The war in Ukraine is having a devastating consequence for the health of Ukraine's people, consequences that will reverberate for years or decades to come. There is severe disruption to health services and access to basic commodities as a result of widespread destruction of infrastructure, including health facilities. WHO has verified 43 attacks on health care, with 12 people killed and 34 injured, including health workers. In any conflict, attacks on health care are a violation of international humanitarian law. They deprive people of urgently needed care and break already restrained health systems. The disruption to services and supplies in Ukraine is posing an extreme risk to people with cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, HIV, and TB, which are among the leading causes of mortality in Ukraine. Displacement, poor shelter, and overcrowded living conditions caused by the conflict are likely to increase the risk of diseases such as measles, pneumonia, and polio. Services for mental health and psychosocial support are urgently needed to help people cope with the effects of the war. There are more than 35,000 mental health patients in Ukrainian psychiatric hospitals and long-term care facilities, which are facing severe shortages of medicines, food, heating, blankets, and more. The war is also exacerbating the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in Ukraine. With just 1/3 of the adult population fully vaccinated, this increases the risk of large numbers of people developing severe disease. Critical shortages of oxygen will have an impact on the ability to treat patients with COVID-19 and many other conditions. At least 8 facilities for producing and storing liquid oxygen have now closed. And we're seeking ways of accessing oxygen from neighboring countries and ways to deliver it safely to where it's needed. WHO is on the ground, working with the Ministry of Health and partners to support health workers and the health system to provide care to meet immediate health needs. So far, we have sent about 100 metric tons of medical supplies, including oxygen, insulin, surgical supplies, anesthetics, and blood transfusion kits, enough for 4,500 trauma patients and 450,000 primary healthcare patients for 1 month. Other equipment, including oxygen generators, electrical generators, and defibrillators, have also been delivered, and we're preparing to send a further 108 metric tons. We have now established supply lines from our warehouse in Lviv to many cities of Ukraine, but challenges with access remain. We need unfettered access. We have critical supplies ready for UN joint convoys to enter difficult areas, but so far we have not been successful. Today, for example, the UN convoy to Sumy, that included a WHO truck carrying critical medical supplies was unable to enter. Loads ready for Mariupol remain in staging areas and cannot proceed. Access to this and other areas is now critical. To support Ukraine's health system, WHO is coordinating the deployment of 20 emergency medical teams consisting of experts from many countries to deliver care across a range of disciplines in Ukraine and neighboring countries, which have been generous in welcoming refugees but are struggling to meet their needs, as my colleagues earlier said. Those needs are immense and include continuity of care for basic illnesses, as well as more complex issues like cancer and renal dialysis, maternal and child health, HIV and TB, sexual and reproductive health, and mental health. Refugees and many of those who remain in Ukraine are already very vulnerable, especially women and girls. Protecting them from abuse and exploitation of all kinds must be a top priority for hosting governments and for all international organizations. Mr. President, today I have 3 urgent requests. First, we urge the Security Council to work for an immediate ceasefire and a political solution. Prolonged conflict is in nobody's interest and will only prolong the suffering of the most vulnerable. The life-saving medicine we need right now is peace. Second, we urge all donors to support the response to humanitarian needs in Ukraine and neighboring countries, which are immense and escalating every day. Thanks to donors who front-loaded WHO's contingency fund for emergencies, we were able to respond immediately, deploying these funds were supplemented by additional funding from the UN Central Emergency Response Fund, CERF. However, to sustain the response, we call on donors to fully fund the United Nations Emergency Appeal. As the Undersecretary General said, it's only 36% so far funded. We thank those donors who have already pledged funding to meet the needs of people in Ukraine. And third, although Ukraine is rightly the focus of the world's attention, I urge you not to lose sight of the many other crises in which people are suffering. In Afghanistan, more than half the population is in need, with widespread malnutrition and a surge in measles, among many other challenges. In Ethiopia, the blockade of 6 million people in Tigray for almost 500 days has created a catastrophic food and health crisis. In the Syrian Arab Republic, more than 12 million people are in need of health assistance, almost half of them children. And in Yemen, roughly 2/3 of the population, more than 20 million people, are estimated to be in need of health assistance. Mr. President, in every case, the only solution is peace. I repeat, in every case, the only solution is peace. And our world needs peace more than ever. As if COVID is not enough, to have a devastating war like this is dangerous for the world. I thank you, and back to you.
أشكر
I thank Dr. Ghebreyesus for his briefing and give the floor now to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the briefers for your briefing today. Just 3 weeks ago, Russia launched its unprovoked, unjustified, unconscionable, full-scale invasion into Ukraine and assault on democracy. Now over 3 million refugees have fled the country, creating a devastating humanitarian crisis felt around the world. These refugees are mostly women and children. They stuffed their lives into backpacks and left their homes and everything they knew behind. Today, many of them know that their apartment buildings and streets have been bombed to rubble. And the horrors continue for those who remain in Ukraine. We just heard from the WHO DG that 43 hospitals have been attacked by Russia. 43 hospitals and health facilities. AP reporters on the ground showed the world a mass grave in Mariupol, a narrow trench filled with the bodies of children. Yesterday, Russian forces dropped a powerful bomb that hit a Mariupol theater where hundreds of civilians were hiding. The Russian word for children was written outside the theater, both front and back, in large white letters that could have been seen from the sky. Yet Russian forces bombed it anyway. Local officials have told families to leave their dead relatives lying outside on the streets, exposed to the world, because it is simply too dangerous with the bombs and shellings to hold funerals. I just met with Ukrainian civil society leaders. They reported that people standing in a bread line, trying to get food to feed their families, were shot dead by Russian soldiers. They reported terror, the terror that Russia is inflicting across Ukraine on the Ukrainian people. Russia will be held accountable for its atrocities. There's only one way to end this madness. President Putin, stop the killing, withdraw your forces, leave Ukraine once and for all. Yesterday, I listened to President Zelensky's speech to the United States Congress, and I was so moved by his words, his bravery, and his calls for help and for peace. Immediately afterward, President Biden announced another $800 million in security assistance to help Ukraine defend itself. That's more than $1 billion in the past week alone. We're not doing this by ourselves. Our allies and partners are fully committed to surging assistance to the Ukrainians. And we are grateful to all of our allies and partners who have opened their borders and their hearts and welcome Ukrainian refugees. We're also going to continue to provide humanitarian relief to support people within Ukraine and those who have been forced to flee, including the $186 million in additional assistance that Secretary Blinken announced on Tuesday. Here at the United Nations, we believe the best way to address the humanitarian crisis is through a resolution in the UN General Assembly. The resolution in the General Assembly will reflect the views of the overwhelming majority of UN member states and Ukraine itself. The International Court of Justice issued a profound and important order yesterday to the Russian Federation, and we call on Russia to comply immediately. Russia has clearly violated international law by violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Russia's brutal tactics have killed civilians, medics, and some of the journalists who have been showing us all the truth of this war. Russia has attacked so much of what we hold sacred and everything the United Nations stands for. Russia's actions must be condemned in no uncertain terms. As President Biden said, Ukraine will never be a victory for Putin. No matter what advances he makes, no matter whom he kills or what cities he destroys, Ukraine will never be a victory for him. The United States stands with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, and we will do everything in our power to end this tragic, unnecessary war. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement and give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Rosemary, for your clarity and the very valuable information you provide every time you come to brief the Council. Thank you, Mr. Mazou and Director General Ghebreyesus, for your sobering information. Dear colleagues, 3 weeks into this unprovoked, unjustified, illegal, and deadly aggression by Russia, and the terrible facts are hardly surprising since anticipated nearly to the detail. Massive casualties among civilians, mass graves, widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure, ruined homes, schools, and hospitals, lives blown away by bombardments, children's dreams charred into smoke. There is no need to describe this devastating situation. Yet, as we just heard, and by the top UN representatives, not by the so-called West hysteria, is soul-wrenching and coincides with the shocking media reports on the horrors of the war and the misery unleashed upon Ukraine for no reason. I will maybe just recall the summarizing words of the Secretary General when he said 2 days ago, "Ukraine is in fire and is being decimated." Guess by who? Over 3 million refugees in only 3 weeks, more than the entire population of my country. Some 2 million people displaced internally, 12 million people affected in the areas hardest hit by the war. UNICEF has evidence that since the start of the war, forced by this brutal aggression, every second a child has crossed the border of Ukraine. SRSG Patton warns that abuse, risks of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as trafficking, continue to mount amid wide-scale displacement. Several appeals for humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilians went unheeded. Many people remain trapped in areas of conflict and with essential services disrupted are unable to meet their basic needs, including food, water, and medicine. For the estimated hundreds of thousands who remain, there is simply nowhere to go. They can be killed even for queuing for bread, as it happened. This is the angry and the true face of the Russian aggression. Mr. President, the director of WHO that we just heard confirmed that there have been 33 attacks on Ukrainian healthcare facilities, infrastructure, and workers since the beginning of the invasion, otherwise 2 every day. There are, unfortunately, nearly a dozen conflicts in the world today. Out of 89 attacks on health systems around the world this year so far, 33 have been only in Ukraine. Therefore, attacking healthcare facilities and workers is becoming a tactic of war in Ukraine. Nothing is being spared. First, there was this maternity ward in Mariupol. Then there was a mosque. Yesterday, Russians bombed the drama theater in Mariupol, a shelter for nearly 1,000 citizens who were not able to flee the city. And as it was mentioned, the word "children" in large Russian script was painted on the ground outside the theater. Everything must be bombed. Despite this grueling picture, the main news is not just what I said. The main news is that Ukraine is holding on, that Ukraine is resisting, that Ukraine is winning and Russia is deep in the mud. On the ground, morally, legally, and internationally. And we know now that for Russia to win this war of choice, it has to Grozny the entire Ukraine. It has to Aleppo all its cities. It has to Mariupol everything there. And even after that, we will be told here again that it's not their fault. C'est la faute à Voltaire. Mr. President, Ukraine won yesterday the first legal victory at the International Court of Justice. ICJ, the guardian of international law, ruled that there was no evidence to support Russian claims that Ukraine was committing genocide in the Luhansk and Donetsk. The court called for immediate suspension of any kind of military operations by Russia and entities, organizations, or persons under its control. So the question is, will Russia respect the court's order, or will it unplug and cancel itself completely, entirely, from the international law? Mr. President, beyond the human toll, the infrastructure and residential deliberate destructions and large-scale humanitarian crisis, there is another major crisis, the economic impact of the aggression. UNDP has warned that every day of delayed peace will accelerate a free fall into poverty in Ukraine. UNDP again projected yesterday that 90% of the Ukrainian population could be facing poverty and extreme economic vulnerability should the war deepen. In the event of a continuing protracted war in Ukraine, almost 1/3 of the population will fall below the poverty line, and a further 62% will be at extreme risk of falling into poverty within the next 12 months. It warned, again the UNDP, that 18 years of social economic achievement could be lost. And this would set the country, an entire region, back decades, leaving deep social and economic scars for generations to come. Who in this room or outside it believes then a single word from Russia about SDGs, about Agenda 2030, because these terrible effects will not only be felt in Ukraine, but in the entire world? Mr. President, Russia has proposed a text for a humanitarian resolution. We think it is wrong. It is worst. It's a mockery of proportions, a move worth of the Guinness record of hypocrisy. Russia cannot shoot first and then come disguised as a doctor. The only way to minimize humanitarian consequences for the Ukrainian population is simple. Russia has to stop the war, withdraw its troops, and go home. No one should get confused by a text just because it is called humanitarian, when the only aim is to provide cover for the war. So colleagues, don't fall for the new clothes of the emperor. The Russian aggression is naked out there. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania and give the floor to the representative of the UK.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I join others in thanking our briefers today as well. As we've heard, it's 3 weeks since we met in this chamber to make one final effort to avert a Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's 3 weeks since we were interrupted by the news that President Putin had abandoned diplomacy and chosen war. These have been 3 devastatingly long weeks for the people of Ukraine, for the 3 million people who have fled, and for those who have stayed. As we heard from the UN, Russian forces are laying siege to populated cities and towns and indiscriminately shelling residential areas with high-impact weaponry, including cluster munitions. 43 healthcare facilities, including a maternity hospital, have been attacked, killing the most vulnerable and depriving civilians of access to medical assistance. And President Putin's war is causing suffering well beyond Ukraine's borders. Thousands of students, many from nations around this table, have been caught up in the violence. The war is spiking food and energy prices, bringing further pain to countries in the developing world already suffering from the impact of COVID and famine and conflict and climate. Millions of refugees have been taken in by countries across Europe. Mr. President, colleagues, 3 weeks since the start of Russia's invasion, one point should be clear in our minds. This is an unprovoked war of aggression waged by Russia. Russia is responsible for the suffering it has inflicted on Ukraine and beyond. Russia alone can end this war. 141 UN member states have unequivocally condemned Russia's illegal invasion. The International Court of Justice has issued a legally binding order requiring Russia to suspend military action in Ukraine immediately. This week, perversely, Russia tabled a resolution that, among other things, called for the protection of civilians, including women and children. This is cynical game playing in the face of human suffering. Just yesterday, in Mariupol, Russian forces reportedly targeted civilians taking cover from the onslaught, despite the word children written on the ground where they sheltered. If Russia really wanted to protect women and children, it would withdraw its troops from Ukraine and end this illegal invasion today. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the UK for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I thank the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, the Assistant High Commissioner for Refugees, and the Director General of the WHO for their briefings. These briefings reveal, with the impartiality and the rigor that the United Nations is known for in its work, the reality of this war that has been waged for 3 weeks now by the Russian Federation. The reality is the deaths of innocent civilians, as well as journalists and medical personnel. It is the chaos created throughout the country and well beyond its borders, in particular because of the worsening food insecurity throughout the world. It's the millions of lives disrupted of those who were forced to flee their homes and who find no respite, whether in hospitals or in schools. With its European partners, France will continue to mobilize to welcome these refugees, and we will continue to provide support to Ukrainians. And to this end, we have disbursed 100 million euros. France calls on Russia to immediately cease its bloody war and to comply with the International Court of Justice's order issued yesterday. We condemn in the strongest terms the siege against Ukrainian cities and the indiscriminate bombings targeting civilian populations. We call on Russia to abide by international humanitarian law, to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, and to allow safe and unfettered delivery of humanitarian assistance. Attacks against hospitals rise to the level of war crimes, and we also condemn the targeting of journalists, and we recall the obligation of armed forces to protect them. We are particularly concerned at reports of Russia's use of cluster munitions. We once again condemn the support of the Belarusian regime for this deadly offensive, and we also condemn the use by the Russian Federation of mercenaries, notably Syrian mercenaries. This is in no way an absolution of Russia and its responsibility. Russia must give an account for its crimes. We welcome the opening of an investigation by the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC into this situation. France denounces the cynicism of Russia, which claims to be concerned at the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, where it is, and yet it is the only one responsible. If we support their draft resolution, this would be giving them the green light to continue their war. Mr. President, despite the destruction and suffering, the war in Ukraine also revealed another reality. The people of Ukraine are showing admirable resistance, and we welcome their courage and the courage of their authorities. The international community is united in its massive condemnation of Russian aggression, and many countries, including France, have immediately taken measures targeting Russian authorities and the economic circles close to Russian power to cut off access to their resources and to prevent them from continuing this war. These sanctions have already proved effective and will be further strengthened to make it more expensive to wage this war and until the Russian authorities give up their.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, President. I also would like to thank Under Secretary General de Carlo, Assistant High Commissioner Mazou, and Director General Dr. Tedros for their very sobering briefings. Their messages are grim, very grim. We commend all humanitarian organizations working to alleviate the man-made catastrophe being visited on Ukraine. President, the cause of this catastrophe is clear. 3 short weeks ago, as we sat in this very chamber, as the Secretary General pleaded for peace, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine. Since then, we have witnessed wanton devastation in a sovereign, independent nation with no regard for human life. To date, over 3 million people have had to flee Ukraine, becoming refugees in neighboring countries. We heard today 90% of those forced out of their homes and into uncertainty are women and children. Families torn apart. At least 2 million people are internally displaced, increasingly vulnerable and in need of immediate support. Ordinary people traumatized by a cruel and reckless war. Women and girls face heightened risk of being subjected to sexual and gender-based violence, including rape and trafficking. Their right to protection is being ignored. The destruction of the basic services all of us here at this table take for granted, food, water, sanitary systems, health and education, is having a devastating effect in Ukraine. Civilian casualties, we know, are in the thousands. Irish journalist Pierre Sachevsky was tragically killed alongside Ukrainian journalist Sasha Kushnova. They were both working to shine a light on Ukraine's plight. Our thoughts are with their families and every grieving and suffering Ukrainian family. Courageous journalists are showing the horrific impact of Russian aggression. I salute the free media putting their lives on the line to show us the truth. The humanitarian impact of this war is being felt around the world. It will affect the food security of countries heavily reliant on Ukrainian agricultural products, including in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. It will cause severe harm far beyond the borders of Ukraine. President, I find it a damning indictment that this Council has to plead with the Russian Federation not to deprive civilian populations of food and water, not to deny them the basic infrastructure they need for daily existence, for survival. It's a damning indictment that we in this Council have not been able to speak with a united voice to save innocent lives in this war. President, the images from a besieged Mariupol are shocking. We see once again that urban warfare takes the heaviest toll on civilians. We deplore the targeting of healthcare facilities, doctors taken hostage, life-saving care interfered with by military forces. Last week's attack by Russian forces on a maternity hospital in Mariupol plumbed new depths, resulting in the death of a mother and her newborn baby, a baby that never had a chance. We have to ask how many more. The residents of Mariupol are now melting snow or siphoning water from heating systems to quench their thirst. They're cutting down trees for firewood for cooking and to stay warm in freezing night temperatures. The city's supermarkets emptied because the basic necessities of life cannot be safely brought into the city. It is chilling to think that the suffering forced on Mariupol may be visited on other Ukrainian cities. There can be no justification for this brutal aggression. It should never have been perpetrated. It must be stopped. Ireland calls on the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations to protect civilian healthcare facilities and medical and humanitarian personnel. It must facilitate the safe passage and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance, including medical and food supplies. Whatever is agreed or not agreed on humanitarian corridors or other measures, civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected under international humanitarian law. This applies both to those who choose to leave and those who choose to remain. Surely, the most basic respect for human life must mean something to the aggressor even now. Let's be clear, the provision of humanitarian assistance is not dependent on a ceasefire. It is dependent on those bombing cities doing the right thing in accordance with their obligations. President, attacks directed against civilians and civilian objects, indiscriminate attacks and disproportionate attacks are all prohibited under international humanitarian law. Ireland remains gravely concerned by the humanitarian harm arising from use of explosive weapons in populated areas in Ukraine. There have been reports of the use of cluster munitions and thermobaric weapons by Russian military forces. These weapons cause mass casualties. They pose great risk for civilians when deployed in urban areas, including long after fighting has ceased. Their use is unconscionable. Equally, any use of white phosphorus against civilians or civilian infrastructure is abhorrent and contrary to international law. President, not only is Russia's war in Ukraine morally wrong, it is illegal. Yesterday, in granting Ukraine's request for provisional measures against the Russian Federation, the International Court of Justice was clear, it was emphatic. Russia must immediately suspend the military operations in Ukraine. In light of the court's decision, which is binding on the Russian Federation, which it cannot ignore, Ireland once again calls on the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations under international law and immediately end its aggression, unconditionally withdraw its forces from the entire territory of Ukraine, and refrain from further threat or use of force of any kind against Ukraine or any other member state. President, colleagues, for 3 long weeks, diplomacy has proved unavailing. For 3 long weeks, the world has watched this war with horror. Yet, we believe there is still a chance for peace. We urge the Russian Federation to do the right thing and commit to the diplomatic path in good faith. It is never too late to do the right thing. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة إيرلندا على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة لممثلة النرويج.
Thank you, President. I join others in thanking briefers for their sobering presentations. 3 weeks ago, Russia launched its military aggression and invaded Ukraine. And since the start of the war, a Ukrainian child has become a refugee almost every second. Over 3 million civilians have crossed the borders into neighboring countries seeking protection, and over 2 million people are displaced inside Ukraine. They are fleeing from the horrors of Russia's unjust and illegal war against Ukraine, from the destructive power of one of the world's biggest war machines, from Russia's shelling of homes, schools, and hospitals, from Russia's indiscriminate use of explosive weapons and their deplorable use of cluster bombs, weapons that destroy cities, killing civilians even while they are fleeing or hiding. The human suffering is unacceptable. We encourage countries to keep their borders open to all those seeking safety outside Ukraine without discrimination. And we commend the generosity of the neighboring countries and their solidarity with those fleeing the war. Many of those fleeing are in a vulnerable situation, as we heard from Dr. Tedros, at risk of sexual and gender-based violence, trafficking, and other forms of exploitation, traumatized children and adults in need of mental and psychosocial support. We encourage the humanitarian organization to give priority to these issues in their response. President, civilians must be protected at all times, and humanitarian and medical workers must also be protected and allowed safe, rapid, and unhindered access to people in need. The protection of civilians and humanitarian access are not a matter of choice. They are legal obligation under international humanitarian law, obligation which must be respected. And those responsible for violation must be held accountable. President, Russia's war is causing despair and suffering with global implication. Russia is responsible for the increased food prices and higher risk of food insecurity that many countries now face. Russia's war against Ukraine will further exacerbate humanitarian crisis, death, and disaster for people across continents. Russia, and Russia alone, bears the sole responsibility for the war and humanitarian crisis. Russia must stop its military aggression against Ukraine. Russia must comply with the order by the International Court of Justice to immediately suspend its military operation in Ukraine. If Russia cares about the humanitarian suffering this war is causing, then Russia should stop its senseless and illegal war. The Russian draft resolution has no credibility. It will not stop the war and the suffering. We echo the call of the Secretary General that political dialogue, negotiation, and mediation are the only way forward. We need to see genuine talks that translate into concrete results on the ground, and they must be inclusive. We need to see women included meaningfully in all talks, negotiation, and mediation efforts. And for the sake of humanity, this war must stop. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة النرويج على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة لممثل.
I thank the representative of Norway, and India has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me thank USD Carlo, UNHCR Assistant High Commissioner Mazzo, and WHO Director General Dr. Ghebreyesus for their respective briefing on the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. India continues to remain deeply concerned at the ongoing situation, which has progressively deteriorated since the beginning of the hostilities. The conflict has resulted in death of civilians, displacement of thousands of people internally, and outflow of more than 3 million refugees to neighboring countries. The humanitarian situation has worsened, particularly in the conflict zones. There is an urgent need, therefore, to address the humanitarian needs of the affected population. In this regard, we support the initiatives of the UN and its agencies who have mobilized whatever is possible in the shortest possible time frame. We hope the international community will continue to respond positively to the humanitarian needs of the people of Ukraine, including through extending generous support to Secretary General's flash appeal and the Regional Refugee Response Plan on Ukraine. Keeping in view the dire humanitarian situation unfolding in Ukraine, India has already sent over 90 tons of humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighbors as a part of the 9 separate tranches of humanitarian assistance delivered thus far. These supplies have included medicines and other essential relief material. We are in the process of identifying other such requirements and sending further supplies in the coming days. India has ensured the safe return of about 22,500 Indians from Ukraine. We have also assisted nationals from 18 other countries in that process. We are deeply appreciative of the facilitation rendered by the authorities of Ukraine and its neighboring countries in ensuring their safe return. Allow me to underscore that it is important that the humanitarian action is always guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, which is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should not be politicized. We reiterate our call for immediate cessation of hostilities across Ukraine. Our Prime Minister has reiterated this on several occasions and called for immediate ceasefire and emphasized that there is no option but the path of dialogue and diplomacy. We stand ready to continue to engage on these objectives in the Security Council as well as with the parties in the coming days. We continue to underline the need to respect the UN Charter, international law, and the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of states. I thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر ممثل الهند على بيانه.
I thank the representative of India, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana. The representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this meeting and also thank the distinguished briefers for the updated information on the prevailing humanitarian situation in Ukraine. I also welcome the participation in this meeting of the representatives of Poland and Ukraine. Mr. President, Ghana reiterates once more the call on the Russian Federation for an unconditional and immediate ceasefire and for the withdrawal of all its invading troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. The cessation of hostilities is critical to save lives and prevent further devastation to the Ukrainian people. It remains fundamental to addressing the worsening humanitarian situation. We remain deeply concerned about the military escalations and the disproportionate use of unconventional munitions in bombarding the cities and civilian populated areas of Ukraine, and we are disheartened by the trauma that the situation has caused, especially to the aged, women, and children. The parties to the conflict must urgently commit to a humanitarian pause to enable the evacuation and safe passage of civilians and facilitate the delivery of food, medicine, and other essential services to those in critical need and those who have been caught up in the cities under siege. We also deplore the attacks on medical facilities and call for the protection of humanitarian workers and medical personnel. We urge the parties to comply with their commitments under international law and international humanitarian law, in particular, the provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949 relating to the protection of civilian persons in the time of war. We continue to urge the parties to accept the path of diplomacy and dialogue in resolving their security concerns. We believe that the good offices of the Secretary General should be leveraged to facilitate a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Mr. President, in concluding, I wish to emphasize that the interest and safety of the Ukrainian people should be prioritized and must be at the forefront of the actions of this Council and all other international actions. I thank you for your kind attention.
أشكر ممثلة غانا على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة.
I thank the representative of Ghana, and I now give the floor to Gabon. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'd like to thank Madam De Carlo, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, and Mr. Ralph Mazou for their briefings on the situation, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The intensification of fighting and the massive exodus of civilians ensuing from this and the deterioration in the living conditions and health conditions of those who decide to remain, the risks of disease because of the disruption in basic services are all causes for concern. We once again call on all the parties to comply with the provisions of international humanitarian law and to ensure respect for and protection of populations, including African nationals and civilian infrastructure, medical personnel, and humanitarian personnel as well. We reiterate the urgency of opening up safe humanitarian corridors, and we call for the immediate cessation of hostilities. Saving lives must come before any political consideration. The parties to the conflict must use all options offered by diplomacy to, through dialogue, achieve a negotiated settlement and to avoid a stagnation in the situation. Thank you.
الغابون على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة.
I thank the representative of Gabon, and I now give the floor to Kenya.
Mr. President, I thank the briefers for their presentations this afternoon. Kenya is gravely concerned that 3 weeks on, the armed conflict in Ukraine has continued unabated. The continuing reports of loss of lives and displacement and separation of loved ones, including through millions of refugees in just 3 weeks, is deeply disturbing. Kenya extends its condolences to the families who have lost loved ones to the conflicts and stands in solidarity with all the affected. We commend Ukraine's neighbors for opening their borders to refugees of multiple nationalities, and we urge them to continue ensuring that protections sought are offered with no discrimination on any basis, and particularly in regard to race or religion. Kenya condemns the targeting on and destruction of civilian objects and infrastructure, particularly residential homes, hospitals, and shelters. The parties are obliged to comply with international humanitarian law. We remind that civilians, including foreign nationals in Ukraine, are not party to the conflict and must not be a target. In this regard, all actors, including the parties, must consider to prioritize the safety and interests of civilians in accordance with international humanitarian law. The imperative to ensure that humanitarian passages are open and functioning in all times cannot be overstated. We believe that there is an urgent need for humanitarian resolution that reflects the unity and the resolve of this Council to assist the people of Ukraine. Ultimately, the only way out of this crisis is an immediate and unconditional cessation of the military campaign. We urge the parties to do this to allow humanitarian assistance to flow and create room for diplomacy and constructive dialogue, including through the good offices of the UN Secretary General, towards a sustainable political solution. We underscore the need for an urgent resolution of this armed conflict. Its impact is already being felt through increased food prices, fertilizer, oil, and other essentials by multiple countries. If it is not quickly prevented, this trend, including the added effects of unilateral sanctions, will aggravate state fragilities and fuel ongoing conflicts across the world, especially in the global south. In closing, Mr. President, Kenya restates its recognition of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
أشكر ممثلة كينيا على بيانها.
I thank the representative of Kenya, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you. Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank for their briefings Ms. Rosemary de Carlo, the WTO Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus, and Mr. Raouf Mazou from UNHCR. As the conflict in Ukraine lingers on, the dire humanitarian situation in the region is further deteriorating. Brazil is deeply concerned with the growing number of civilian casualties, including children, as well as the increasing flows of refugees and internally displaced people. According to some estimates, the number of people impacted by the conflict is around 18 million, of which more than 6 million are internally displaced and nearly 3 million people have fled Ukraine. The destruction of infrastructure has caused food shortages, energy outages, and intermittent communications. Under these circumstances, supply chains have been disrupted. The access to medical facilities is impaired. Medical supplies are running low, their distribution is uncertain, and some stockpiles are out of reach due to military operations. Hospitals and medical personnel are struggling to provide care to the sick and wounded. In response to the most pressing needs for humanitarian assistance, the Brazilian government has sent last week a donation encompassing water purifiers, around 9 tons of foods, and half a ton of medical items, totaling approximately 20,000 items donated by the Brazilian Ministry of Health. With the assistance of the Embassy of Brazil in Warsaw, the supplies were landed at that capital and delivered to Ukraine in coordination with the country's authorities. The international community must come to the assistance of the people most in need, not only those directly afflicted by the hostilities in Ukraine territory, but also refugees in the neighboring countries. We commend the World Health Organization for its work to ensure the delivery of health supplies to Ukraine and its neighboring countries. The availability of medical personnel, medicines, and health equipment is crucial to meet the urgent needs of those sick and wounded. At this moment, Ukraine's health system is under critical pressure to cope with the demands for assistance from the many victims of this conflict. It is distressing to know that as of 12 March, the World Health Organization had verified 31 attacks on healthcare facilities in Ukraine, resulting in dozens of deaths and injuries, including health workers. The attacks against healthcare are particularly worrisome since they deprive people of life-saving services. Attacks on healthcare are violations of international humanitarian law. We reiterate our position that the immediate cessation of hostilities in Ukraine is the main condition to guarantee the passage of civilians from conflagrated zones to safe areas. Moreover, only with a comprehensive and effective ceasefire, it would be allowed the rapid, safe, and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance to those in need. I thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر ممثل البرازيل على بيانه.
I thank Brazil, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We listened very carefully to our briefers, and we share the concerns voiced by the UN on the humanitarian crisis, which is unfolding in a number of regions in Ukraine. Our colleagues in Security Council are also rightfully pointing to it. But the difference here is that the assessments of some, in particular Western states, are based in addition, above and beyond the situation with refugees, on the hyped up campaign of lies and disinformation in Ukraine is reaching new heights. And it started at the very beginning at the special military operations. Today, we've heard a whole slew of such information from our colleagues. The accusation about the shelling of the infamous now maternity hospital in Mariupol and the shelling of the Mariupol theater, and the fact that Russia is not allowing refugees to leave, and that Russia shelled the mosque of Sultan Suleiman in Mariupol, and that Russia using automatic weapons to shoot a bread line in Chernigov. And this has been refuted many a time. The American colleague referred to the Director General of WHO, who allegedly said that Russia, 33 hospitals were bombed by Russia. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the Director General of WHO, and please ask him, did not say this. As far as we know, it is not within their rules to attribute who conducted a strike against a medical facility. Now, on the issue of the attribution, who is at fault when it comes to destroying medical facilities in Ukraine is something that we have many questions about, and we'll revert to that. Now, in Chernigov, the line in Chernigov, this has been refuted many a time ago. There are no Russian military in Chernigov. I think that this is a consequences of just distributing weapons to whoever wants to have them in Ukraine. During this time, in addition to other kinds of weaponry, 25,000 pieces of automatic weapons had been distributed to population at large. Now, the mosque, the Sultan Suleiman Mosque in Mariupol, the president of the fund of the mosque of Sultan Suleiman Mosque in Mariupol refuted the fact that the Turkish mosque with 80 people was shelled by Russia from the east. So I don't know who will end up in the Guinness Book of Records, but I do know who will hold the record on fakes voiced during one single meeting of Security Council. That will be a Guinness Book record. As I already said, a sort of symbol of the fabric manufacturing fakes by the Ukrainians and the Westerners are the situation in Mariupol and around the city. Well, let me explain to you why this place is special. In the course of events in 2014-2015, when the Ukrainian warmongers threw against those who were in disagreement with the Maidan authorities, those who lived in the east of the country, it threw planes and tanks against them. At that time, Mariupol was one of the main centers of resistance in the Donetsk People's Republic, and its citizens almost unanimously supported the independence of the republic during the referendum, and they were actively speaking out against the nationalist Kiev regime. And the Ukrainian Nazis cannot forget that, cannot forgive that. They drowned the city in blood, and they made it in a sort of headquarters and the mainstay of voluntary Nazi battalions, first and foremost, the Azov Battalion and the Right Sector 1. The Mariupol airport had the infamous jail, which is also a torture center with all of the attributes belonging thereof. It had the ditches with bodies of people, solitary confinement cells, and chainsaws. This is not even the Middle Ages. This is neo-Nazism. And that is precisely why the Ukrainian radicals are clinging to this city so much. First of all, it covers up many a proof of their crimes. And second of all, they understand that they will have to be held accountable for those. And that's why they stand ready to drag into the to drag into the grave almost entire population of Mariupol. Exactly the way it was done by the Nazis in Berlin in 1945 when it was besieged. They also hold people as human shields. They do not allow them to evacuate, and they place right next to residential buildings heavy weaponry in violation of international humanitarian law. And this is something that our Western partners and unfortunately the Secretariat representatives is something they persistently do not want to see. But it's very difficult to cover up facts, and here we would like to point you to the ICRC statement, which sheds light on these facts. In such a situation, it's not a surprise that Mariupol has become almost a leader on the number and ingeniousness of the fakes, and their manufacturing has become almost a main job of the Ukrainian regime. And let me just dwell on the three most egregious of them. And the first one, of course, is the former maternity hospital in Mariupol, allegedly destroyed by the Russian missile. I'm not going to dwell on this too long. Let me just simply say that we covered this earlier, and this information is something that we put into a letter sent to the Secretary General. It is very difficult to find a rational explanation to the fact that our Western colleagues decided not only to notice a warning in advance, the warning we issued telling everyone that the Rodom had become a military firing post for the nationalists, they also ignored the irrefutable fact about the stage nature of the situation there along the lines of what was being done by the white helmets. And they also ignoring the opinion of ballistic experts who say nothing hit the building, but rather there was an explosion there. The second fake is something that we heard about today also from our Western colleagues. Russia allegedly hit the Mariupol theater, where more than 1,000 people had sought refuge. In actual fact, already on the 13th of March, there was widely available public information provided by private people in Mariupol who managed miraculously to escape the city. They were saying that Azov is holding in that building a huge number of people and is preparing a bloody provocation. We therefore are not surprised by the fact that in front of the building you can see the word children written down on soil. The Russian armed forces were informed about the situation, and the building of the theater was never considered as a target for a strike. But the fact that in such places of provocation, you can very frequently find Western reporters who briskly report on that. And this is something that's become a tragic hallmark of provocations in Ukraine, who are covering up the excesses conducted by nationalist battalions and Ukrainian armed forces. After the Western propaganda efforts to make sure that the mass media throughout the world show a picture of a person who had lost his wife because of the Ukrainian strike by Tochka-U with cluster ammunition against the center of Donetsk, and this is presented as something that had taken place in Kiev. After that, it's very difficult for us to ask you to be rational in your assessments. Once again, let me recall that neither one of you or Western mass media said anything about the tragedy in Donetsk, which resulted in 20 deaths of civilians. And the third fake, now, Russia allegedly is forcing the people from Mariupol and other Ukrainian towns into Russia. Therefore, only humanitarian corridors into Ukraine should be opened. This is a barefaced lie. Since the beginning of a special military operation, the hotline of the Ministry of Defense of Russia received more than 2.5 million requests for being evacuated into Russia. Unfortunately, we have to state that we have not been able to evacuate everyone yet, but this is because the Ukrainian authorities are prohibiting people from doing that. But during the previous 24 hours alone, from the finally opened up long-suffering Mariupol, we managed to ensure the evacuation of more than 31,000 civilians, including 89 foreign nationals, amongst whom 71 OSCE staff, 9 Greek nationals, and 9 Pakistani nationals. Out of the 31,000 evacuees, only 36 people moved to the Kiev-controlled territories in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. The rest of them opted for Russia and in the areas of Zaporozhye and Kherson Oblast under the control of the Russian armed forces and categorically refused to move over to the territories under Kiev control. The whole humanitarian operation was conducted by the DNR forces and Russian armed forces without any participation from the Ukrainian side. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the car jam at the exit of Mariupol of people moving towards Berdyansk and Melitopol, freed from Ukrainian Nazis, is 10 kilometers long. Until Russian liberators entered the city, this is not something that was seen, and this is not a surprise because the peaceful civilians were needed by the Nazis as a human shield. And those who escaped from Mariupol are telling us about mass atrocities and crimes conducted by the territorial defense, but the abuses against the elderly, women and children. And all of these people are being individually provided with medical and psychological assistance. The situation in other areas varies. Yesterday, we have fully complied with the quiet guns regimes along the humanitarian corridors proposed by the Ukrainian side on the Kiev, Zaporozhye, Zhytomyr, Sumsk, Kharkovsk, and Poltav directions. And this has been many times confirmed by the means of objective control, including with the use of drones. On the humanitarian corridors opened towards Russia, neo-Nazis were not allowing people to go. They threatened them, and those who managed to break through were being shot at. Yesterday, in the Kharkov direction, once again, there was a column of buses full of refugees. They are moving along the humanitarian corridor towards Russia. It was being shelled. As a result, 4 people died and they're injured. But despite all of the difficulties and all of the impediments, during yesterday alone, without the participation of Kiev, we managed to evacuate from dangerous areas 12,440 people, out of them 2,242 children. Overall, since the beginning of a special military operation, already 271,000 people, out of them 58,000 children have been evacuated. They have crossed the border of Russia. And this includes 31,000 individual cars. And we stand ready to take even more. In the subjects of Russian Federation, we have more than 9,500 points of temporary housing. In the liberated territories, we create all of the conditions to make sure that those who want to can accede to the humanitarian assistance, which remains in many places the only possible means of survival. The medicines, clothes, and foods which are received from international organizations, in particular from ICRC, is something that the mayors of Ukrainian cities resell to local entrepreneurs. These facts have been reliably established in Zhytomyr, in Ivano-Frankivsk, in Vinnytsia, in Rovno, in Lutsk, in Dubna, in Vladimir-Volynski, and in Lvov. Hostages, basically hostages of the territorial defense battalions are 6,910 of foreign nationals from 22 states. Also, crews of 70 foreign ships are blocked in the seaports of Ukraine because there's a very high danger of mines, and this was created by Kievan authorities in their internal waters and territorial sea. And this also is related to the possible provocations by the Ukrainian armed forces from the shore. We continue sending humanitarian assistance to the needy in Ukraine. And Mariupol alone received more than 450 tons of food, medicines, and basic necessities. Overall, starting with the 2nd of March, our emergency services and the Ministry of Defense supplied to various regions of Ukraine, including Donbass, supplied about 3,000 tons of humanitarian cargo, including construction materials. Another issue here is that in a number of cases, the local administrations are threatening punishment to those who receive Russian humanitarian assistance. And against this, basically every day we see information from Western capitals that they are providing Kiev with yet another cargo of all kinds of weaponry. Yesterday, Washington announced that this week Ukraine will receive from them defense assistance to the amount of $1 billion. You are fueling this conflict, pouring oil into it. It is already clear now what kind of tragedy resulted from simply distributing light weapons to anyone who wanted them without any control. I wonder whether the Western taxpayers know about the risks of this weaponry ending up with the terrorist groups in Europe, portable air defense weapons, for example. Do you understand how dangerous it is to fuel the situation in Ukraine, how dangerous it is for your own security? Everyone has heard about the drone which landed in Croatia. It was full of explosives. It was not noticed, even though it crossed over several countries from the western point in Ukraine to Zagreb. That's more than 700 kilometers. Mr. President, we note with regret Ukraine has always was a pawn in the geopolitical struggle against Russia and remains such a pawn still. Western politicians couldn't care less about the suffering of the people in Donbass, including women, children, and the elderly. If this were not the case, we would not be now dealing with a salacious uproar surrounding the draft of humanitarian resolutions on Ukraine. After its draft was developed by France and Mexico, it stopped being humanitarian immediately and became full of political formulas which have nothing to do with humanitarian issues. As we were clearly told, the Western countries didn't need this project without them at all. In order to end up with an anti-Russian product, they are ready to push it forward, not in the Security Council, but in the General Assembly, ignoring the fact that this kind of document will help humanitarians nothing. And that is why Russia put forward its own draft containing within it everything that the humanitarians need. It does not contain political assessments. And this is not the kinds of assessment that you can find in other humanitarian resolutions either. And we open this document for the co-sponsorship by all UN members. But we are being told that the humanitarian resolution submitted by Russia is not something that satisfies Western countries. And this shows the true goal of the sponsors of the first so-called humanitarian resolution in the Council. And that is true hypocrisy here. And cynicism. Another point of cynicism is that many colleagues from many delegations tell us about unprecedented pressure by Western partners that their arms are being twisted, including blackmail and threats. The United States and Albania has disseminated a letter in which members of the UN are appealed to refrain from sponsoring our resolution. We do understand how difficult it is for those countries to withstand this kind of onslaught. And therefore, we decided to, at this stage, not to ask for a vote on our draft, but we are not withdrawing the draft resolution. Instead, tomorrow morning, we will ask for an emergency meeting to discuss again the issue of U.S. biolaboratories in Ukraine using the new documents we obtained in the course of the special military operation. And right now, we are going to forward the letter on that to the Emirati presidency. I thank you.
أشكر ممثل
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank USG Carlo, Director General Ghebreyesus, and Assistant High Commissioner Mazu for their briefings just made. China is deeply worried about the worsening humanitarian situation in Ukraine and deplores the reported increase in civilian casualties and refugees. The pressing task now is to call for maximum restraint from all parties and to ensure safety and security of all civilians, including women and children, and meeting their basic humanitarian needs so as to prevent the occurrence of a larger-scale humanitarian crisis. China supports the work by the relevant parties in maintaining communication, ensuring safe and unimpeded humanitarian corridor, and further facilitating personnel evacuation and humanitarian assistance. The number of refugees and displaced persons caused by the conflict is still on the rise, bringing huge impact on Ukraine and the surrounding countries. China supports OCHA, UNHCR, and WHO, among others, in actively conducting operations and mobilizing the international community to assist all those in need. In the recent past, some people of African or Middle East descent encountered difficulties during evacuation. This should be taken seriously and addressed properly. All refugees, regardless of color, race, or religion, shall be accorded the necessary protection under international refugee law. China pays high attention to the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and has put forward a 6-point proposal. The Red Cross Society of China has provided Ukraine with 3 batches of humanitarian supplies, with the third one containing milk powder and quilts for children, specifically helping the Red Cross Society of Ukraine assist displaced children affected by the conflict. We welcome any initiative or proposal from any party that contributes to alleviating and resolving the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. The Security Council bears the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security and should therefore play a positive role in easing the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. China hopes that the Council can stay united on the humanitarian issue and demonstrate a constructive attitude. Mr. President, the international community shares the common aspiration for ceasefire at an early date to alleviate the situation on the ground and to prevent civilian casualties. This is also the aspiration of China. To date, Russia and Ukraine have held 4 rounds of negotiations. Keeping the negotiations going means there is a chance for ceasefire and that there is a chance for a peaceful future. China remains committed to promoting peace through negotiations. We support the UN and the parties concerned in vigorously carrying out good offices. We also hope that all parties will do more to facilitate peace talks and not to add fuel to fire. Facts have proven that wanton use of sanctions will not solve any problem but will instead create new problems. Given the sluggish recovery in global economy, ever-escalating sanctions are undermining stability in international industrial chain and supply chain, thus exacerbating food and energy crisis, damaging people's livelihood in all countries, developing countries in particular, and triggering new humanitarian consequences. This is also an issue that the Security Council shall pay attention to when addressing the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر ممثل الصين
I thank the representative of China, and I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I thank Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo, the Assistant High Commissioner for Operations of the UNHCR, Mr. Mazou, and the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Ghebreyesus, for their briefings. It has been 3 weeks now since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the toll is truly a devastating one. We have heard tragic figures: more than 3 million refugees and almost 1.8 million internally displaced. These are exorbitant numbers, especially if we remember that exactly a month ago we were sitting in this same room evaluating the implementation of the Minsk agreements, during which, and I should mention, we were told that what was taking place on the ground was merely military exercises. So what is the humanitarian outlook if the current pattern continues? I wish to begin by acknowledging the solidarity extended by all those countries that have received refugees, especially those that have received the largest numbers of refugees. But the needs of those persons that were unable to leave or were unable to be evacuated from the urban areas under siege have increased and will continue to increase, especially the needs of those who do not have access to basic services, safe drinking water, foods, and medicines. There is therefore an urgent need to ensure safe and unimpeded access for humanitarian personnel and medical personnel, who are the only ones that can provide these basic services to the civilian population. Mr. President, as we have heard, the World Health Organization has recorded 43 attacks on medical installations in Ukraine. And the fact that the uncontestable fact is that attacking health installations is expressly prohibited under international humanitarian law. There is therefore an urgent need for guarantees that the over 300 medical facilities found along the lines of the conflict or behind the lines of the conflict will not be attacked. We condemn the attacks against medical personnel as well as their vehicles or the equipment they need to do their work. The long-term and short and long-term impact of these attacks against civilian populations and against health facilities can indeed be irreversible, and for that very reason, they are unacceptable. We reiterate our call for compliance with Security Council resolutions dealing with this issue, and that would be Resolution 2286, which includes specific mentions of protection for medical and humanitarian personnel, and Resolution 2573, which refers to civilian property considered as essential. In the same vein, we saw the decision handed down yesterday by the International Court of Justice ordering the immediate suspension of military operations, which began on the 24th of February. As we have stated time and again in this council, the fundamental premise for humanitarian assistance is the cessation of hostilities. Mr. President, while the United Nations and other humanitarian actors focus their efforts on providing the urgent assistance needed by the people, Now is the time as well to reiterate that the only solution to this conflict is through dialogue and diplomacy. We recognize the initiatives underway, including the recent meeting within the framework of the Antalya Forum. Any genuine attempt at negotiations can only be welcome. For this reason, we note with regret that despite our genuine good faith efforts, in which we have been engaged these past 2 weeks, along with France and other member states, whose constructive participation we're very grateful for, this council is as yet unable to issue an unequivocal call for an end to the hostilities. Such a call from this council would be the most significant humanitarian support that the civilian population in Ukraine could receive. Thank you very much.
أشكر ممثل المكسيك على
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement. I shall now make a statement as in my capacity as the representative of the United Arab Emirates. I would like to thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Mr. Rauf Mazu, and Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus for their valuable briefings. What we have heard today reflects the serious deterioration of the humanitarian situation as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. The number of refugees is increasing at an alarming rate. Civilians throughout Ukraine continue to suffer due to the obstacles hindering the delivery of humanitarian assistance, such as food, medical equipment, and other basic needs. At the same time, damage to civilian infrastructure continues to worsen the humanitarian situation in major Ukrainian cities such as Mariupol. In this context, my country would like to focus on 4 main points. First, we remain hopeful about the ongoing negotiations between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. We hope that these negotiations will pave the way for calm to allow humanitarian organizations to carry out their role and meet the needs of civilians. There is an urgent need to take concrete steps aimed at de-escalating the situation on the ground and building trust between the parties. To enable humanitarian organizations to deliver aid safely to those in need and allow safe and unhindered passage for civilians fleeing the conflict and ensuring their protection. Second, my country appreciates the critical role of neighboring countries, especially Poland, Romania, and Moldova, as well as other countries, in responding to the humanitarian crisis by receiving refugees and expanding social safety networks to meet their needs. At the same time, and drawing from our experiences in the Middle East, we recognize the need to support these countries in order to provide care to refugees, especially as the continuation of the current conflict entails continued waves of displacement. Third, in parallel to the ongoing rounds of negotiations, my country stresses the importance of adhering to international law, in particular, international humanitarian law. Violating international law not only represents a threat to the rights of civilians, but also a threat to the entire international order. In this regard, we reiterate our call for all concerned parties to respect their international obligations and to stop targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. In conclusion, the UAE believes that the Council's response to the humanitarian crisis resulting from the conflict in Ukraine should focus on humanitarian action in a concrete and productive manner, in coordination with OCHA and other relevant humanitarian actors. We reaffirm that a solution to the crisis can only be achieved through intensifying diplomatic efforts, immediately ceasing hostilities throughout Ukraine, and seeking a sustainable peace that preserves Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, in addition to enhancing regional and international security and stability. I now resume my functions as President of the Council. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to give an additional intervention. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I was momentarily pleased to hear that the Russians were pulling down the vote on their farcical humanitarian resolution, which was doomed to fail. We know if Russia really truly cared about humanitarian crises, the one that it created, it could simply stop its attacks on the people of Ukraine. But instead, they want to call for another Security Council meeting to use this council as a venue for its disinformation and for promoting its propaganda. Let us not forget that Russia is the aggressor here. They are the ones that are creating a pretext for attacks on their own people, and we can't be fooled by their efforts here. They have troops inside of Ukraine. They are killing people inside of Ukraine. That is the reason for us being here today, not to deal with their propaganda. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة الولايات.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Madam Under-Secretary General Carlo, Director General, Assistant High Commissioner, I also recognize the representative of the aggressor state present here in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. Let me begin with a quote. "The operation is developing successfully and in strict accordance with plans that have been previously approved." End of quote. Said by Putin yesterday, 3 weeks after the unprovoked and unjustified Russian invasion of Ukraine started. Over these weeks, the international community was wrestled with the question, why? Why has the Russian Federation decided to cosplay the Nazi Third Reich by attacking the peaceful neighboring state and plunging the region into war? What are the reasons and what is the plan? And yesterday we got the answer. Killing Ukrainian children, 108 innocent souls so far. Let me quote again, success in the strict accordance with the plans approved previously, according to Putin. Children are deliberate target, given yesterday's bombardment of the Mariupol drama theater, a shelter for hundreds of local residents, mostly women and children. Despite the big signs, children painted on the road on both sides of the building being clearly visible, Russian pilots dropped an aerial bomb. The building was fully damaged, but the shelter fortunately withstood. It did not turn into one of more mass graves, as Putin's plan probably envisaged, previously approved. Of course, Putin's plan does not limit murders to children only. All civilian Ukrainians and foreign citizens are under threat. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights recorded 726 confirmed cases of killing of civilians, while believing that the real figures are considerably higher. And they are indeed. Just yesterday in the city of Chernihiv, 53 civilian residents were killed by Russian bombs and shells. On the same day, in Merefa, Kharkiv region, 21 people were killed following Russian shelling that destroyed the local school and residential buildings. The plan is also to raise Ukrainian cities to the ground: Kharkiv, Sumy, Volnovakha, Akhtirka, Izium, and Mariupol. Pain for Ukraine and the entire world, and an eternal shame for Russia. Almost 2,400 confirmed victims among the civilian population. 90% of the city's infrastructure has been destroyed. Russian troops seized one of the hospitals, gathered 400 civilians there, and used the building as a military position, hiding behind civilians as a human shield. Let me quote, "The sufferings of Mariupol must not become the future of Ukraine," end of quote, said by Peter Maurer, the ICRC president, who is currently in Ukraine. The plan of Putin is to violate the agreements on ceasefire and safe passage for the civilian population from the temporarily occupied territories. Yesterday, Russian troops shelled a convoy of civilian vehicles headed from Mariupol to Zaporizhzhia. 5 people were killed, many injured, including children. And the plan is previously approved: to terrorize local residents who remain in the territories seized by Russian troops. Small villages where the Russian soldiers stay suffer the most. Russians break into houses, throw people out into the streets, take their food. Eyewitness reports of tortures, abductions of local officials, and even extrajudicial killings come from across the occupied territories. Enforcing Ukrainians to flee their homes as refugees has also been a part of this Barbarossa-style plan. Almost 3.2 million refugees have left Ukraine so far. Against the backdrop of the increasingly aggravated humanitarian situation, Russia has dared to table a draft humanitarian resolution of the Security Council. An appeal by a serial killer to the UN members to co-sponsor this most egregious hypocrisy is outrageous. They may like to think twice if they want before they dive into the blood of children and adults executed by the Russian military in Ukraine. And let me quote St. Patrick in this regard: "Never trust a dog to watch your food." At the same time, there is no doubt that action on the humanitarian front in the UN is urgently required, and I encourage all responsible nations to support the relevant efforts in the General Assembly. I also encourage all to join the group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine, co-founded by Albania, Colombia, Denmark, the Marshall Islands, the Netherlands, and Ukraine. This group will act as a forum among UN member states for the discussion and promotion of accountability measures in Ukraine following the Russian military aggression. Distinguished members of the Security Council, yesterday, the International Court of Justice delivered its order on provisional measures in the case concerning allegations of genocide under the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Ukraine versus Russian Federation. The court ordered that the Russian Federation shall immediately suspend the military operations that it commenced on the 24th February 2022 in the territory of Ukraine. Despite the order being binding on Russia under the UN Charter, today the Kremlin has openly and blatantly disregarded it, stating that they, and I quote, cannot take this order into account, end of quote, because there is no, I quote, agreement between the sides, end of quote. And should it be surprising for us? I don't think so, as from the very first instance of Russia's presence in the UN, it was in contempt of the UN Charter. That was the case when Russia was allowed to occupy the Soviet seat in the UN and the Security Council. That was the case in Georgia, in Syria, as well as in Ukraine's Crimea and Donbass in 2014. I encourage the Security Council members to exercise their duties envisaged by the Article 94.2 of the UN Charter to make recommendations or decide upon measures to be taken in the case of Russia's failure to comply with the obligations incumbent upon it under the judgment rendered by the court. Mr. President, perpetration-induced traumatic stress, although known as PITS, is a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Its symptoms are caused by being an active participant in causing trauma. Sufferers of PITS may be found in many roles, such as soldiers or executioners, where they are expected to cause trauma, including death. But diplomats, especially here in the United Nations, especially here in the Security Council, compared to the more well-known and understood PTSD, there appears to be greater severity and different symptom patterns for those affected by PITS. The case of the military aggression of Russia against Ukraine and the mass atrocities perpetrated by the Russian army, ordered by Putin, and defended by the Russian diplomats, will be examined by scholars and scientists, including in the areas of sociology, history, philosophy, psychiatry, and theology. Today, however, I would like to quote from Into the Abyss, a documentary about executioners of the death penalty. One guard began crying and shaking uncontrollably when, I quote, "the eyes of all the inmates he had executed began flashing before him," end of quote. Ambassador, do the eyes of Ukrainian children, women, and elderly killed by the Russians flash before you? If they do, we may consider how to sponsor a decision to help you deal with perpetration-induced traumatic stress. But now have some decency and stop the egregious manipulation of the Security Council. It is obscene. It would be too much dignifying for the Russian delegation if I ended like here, like that. Instead, I would like to quote a tweet by Dario Franceschini, the Italian member of the government, who tweeted today, "Italy is ready to rebuild the theater in Mariupol. The Cabinet of Ministers has approved my proposal to offer Ukraine the resources and means to rebuild it as soon as possible. Theaters of all countries belong to the whole humanity," end of quote. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement and give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, distinguished members of Security Council, I would like to thank Under-Secretary General and the briefers for their important interventions today. And I shall start by paying tribute to the fearless Ukrainian soldiers and civilians alike who defend their homeland, freedom, and the UN Charter. They fight also for those who were forced to flee. I should also express gratitude to the work done by the UN OCHA, UNHCR, WHO, and its partners for maintaining their presence across Ukraine and continuing to deliver the assistance. Excellencies, the Security Council has gathered here today to discuss the fastest growing humanitarian and refugee crisis since the Second World War, the consequence of the Russian aggression on Ukraine. In light of this, I would like to stress the following points. Firstly, this is 100% a war of choice, and the methods of waging it is also the matter of choice. It is Russia that decided to refer to brutal force, indiscriminate weapons, as well as brutal siege tactics. Now they go as far as targeting journalists and kidnapping mayors of Ukrainian cities. In other words, the aggressor decided to change the nature of this conflict. It is a clear manifestation that Russia deliberately chose to create a humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine and bluntly disregards all the principles of international humanitarian law. And this should worry us all. Actually, disregarding the international law has been a pattern that Russia pursued in Syria and other places. To underpin this approach, earlier today the Kremlin has rejected an order by the International Court of Justice under the United Nations highest court to cease its attack on Ukraine. Secondly, without resolving the dire humanitarian situation, there will be no peace. Therefore, we urge Russia to change its military modus operandi and allow full and unimpeded humanitarian access and relief to those in need. The safe passage of civilians from different cities affected by the conflict must be allowed. Take the situation in Mariupol, where still around 350,000 residents remain trapped in the city as food, water, and medicines continue to dry up. These people require urgent humanitarian assistance and are exposed to safety and security risks. Therefore, we call for immediate ceasefire and humanitarian access to most affected areas. Thirdly, the humanitarian consequences of the ongoing war are not limited to Ukrainians in their own home territory. Those who had fled remain affected too. Already more than 3 million were forced to leave Ukraine as a result of Russia's military aggression. We have already reached the number of over 1.9 million people who crossed our border since February 24th. Most of them found a shelter in Poland. We have registered already 170 nationalities on our border. That means it considers us all, and we are all the victims of this aggression. Excellencies, as a neighbor and close friend of Ukraine, we see firsthand the dramatic humanitarian consequences of this war. Every day on the Polish-Ukrainian border, we are witnessing a growing number of people who cross the border severely traumatized. We believe that the involvement of UN bodies and agencies experienced in dealing with this kind of needs, together with the continued efforts of the Polish authorities, will bring rapid and appropriate solution. In the spirit of solidarity, Poland will continue to admit and provide shelter, food, healthcare, and safety to every person in need, regardless of their nationality, race, or religion's creed. Aside from the institutional care, thousands of Polish people are organizing in a bottom-up way, showing the solidarity with Ukraine, opening their homes to refugees, and volunteering at reception centers. Excellencies, as I'm delivering this speech, Poland's president's spouse, Agata Kornhauser-Duda, is building up an international coalition of first ladies and highnesses and all the peoples of goodwill to effectively protect those in vulnerable situations, namely women, children, elderly persons, and persons with disabilities, many of them with post-traumatic disorder. The Polish government has urgently implemented new immigration measures for Ukrainian citizens fleeing their country. The new law that took effect on Monday legalizes the stay of citizens of Ukraine in order to enable them to take up employment and provide them with healthcare, education, and accommodation in Poland. It also offers temporary financial help to Polish citizens who welcomed refugees in their homes. Ukrainian citizens may apply for one-time subsidy to answer their basic needs. The government will allocate funds for schooling of Ukrainian students. Every Ukrainian citizen fleeing the war has been guaranteed the access to the public healthcare system in the same way as Polish citizens have. We will continue to provide assistance to Ukrainian citizens fleeing the horrors of war brought on them by Russia. And I can tell you already we got 45,000 of pupils subscribed to Polish schools from Ukraine. But we and the other countries of the region, which I see the ambassadors here in the room, we all need urgently an assistance of international assistance in these good deeds. Excellencies, today Ukraine pays a high price for defending its independence, territorial integrity and democracy and UN Charter. Determination and courage of Ukrainian people inspires the world. We cannot fail them. It is crucial to show our solidarity with Ukraine and its people by acting now, and I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for his statement. There are no more names on my list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.